Whether you're starting your day with fresh coffee or catching up later, you're tuning into Auto Intelligence. I'm Steve, part of the Auto Agentic team, and this is Claire.
New episodes every Tuesday, and today we're diving into something that's reshaping the entire North American automotive landscape in ways most people haven't fully grasped yet.
Auto Intelligence is produced by Auto Agentic, and what we're seeing right now is a perfect example of how quickly the automotive industry's intelligence architecture can shift when geopolitics meets consumer demand.
So here's what happened. Canada just broke ranks with US trade policy in a major way. They've slashed their tariff on Chinese electric vehicles from 100% down to 6.1%.
And we're not talking about unlimited access. Canada's implementing a quota system, 49,000 Chinese EVs initially, with plans to rise to roughly 70,000 over about 5 years, depending on actual consumer demand.
The response from President Trump was immediate and, well, unambiguous. Quote, "If Canada makes a deal with China, it will immediately be hit with a 100% tariff against all Canadian goods and products coming into the USA."
But Trump went further than that. He accused Mark Carney of being sorely mistaken and warned that China will consume Canada entirely, obliterating its businesses, social structure, and way of life. Those are his exact words.
This isn't just a trade story. This is about intelligence coordination across the entire automotive supply chain. When you change the rules for one player, every other system has to recalibrate, and the speed of that recalibration matters.
Let's start with the deal mechanics, because the details reveal the strategy. In exchange for this EV quota, China is cutting tariffs on Canadian canola seed from around 84% down to about 15%, a massive reduction after years of punitive measures.
So this is agricultural leverage being used to reshape automotive markets. China is also easing restrictions on Canadian peas and some seafood like lobster and crab. Plus, they're adding visa-free travel for Canadians. This is a comprehensive reset package.
And there's a crucial constraint built in. At least half of those Chinese EVs must be affordable, meaning import prices at or below about 35,000 Canadian dollars by 2030. This explicitly pushes affordable EVs into the Canadian market rather than just premium imports.
Which tells you exactly what Canada is trying to solve. Their EV adoption had stalled after federal rebates were scaled back in 2025, even as they're pushing toward their zero-emission vehicle availability standard, 100% zero emission by 2035.
Right, and this is where consumer behavior meets industrial strategy. Gal Raz from Ivy Business School put it simply. The biggest benefit is affordability. Chinese EVs are expected to enter the market at substantially lower price points than many domestic options, making them more accessible for the average Canadian.
But here's what's fascinating from an intelligence perspective. These aren't just cheap cars. Chinese EVs typically arrive with long-range, modern infotainment, advanced driver assist systems, basically resetting consumer expectations about what a base EV should offer.
So you're looking at a scenario where a well-equipped Chinese compact EV could hit Canadian showrooms at $25,000 to $30,000, undercutting many gasoline crossovers even after the 6.1% duty.
And Raz makes an interesting point about market dynamics. Even if Chinese EVs initially account for a small share of sales, their presence could help stimulate demand, which could, in turn, snowball into strengthening Canada's EV market and supporting future manufacturing and job growth at home.
That's the optimistic scenario. But let's talk about the tensions, because that's where the real intelligence challenges emerge. The Canadian Vehicle Manufacturers Association, representing Ford, GM, and Stellantis, they're not happy about this timing.
CVMA President Brian Kingston warned that this comes at a very sensitive point in US-Canada trade negotiations and could endanger the integrated North American auto supply chain.
His exact words were, "Canada and the auto industry depends and always will depend on our access to the United States." He's warning that opening the door to China could place the broader economy at severe risk if it triggers US retaliation.
Which brings us to the intelligence architecture challenge. The North American auto industry is deeply integrated. Vehicles and parts cross the Canada-US border multiple times before final assembly. Many vehicles built in Canada contain a high share of US components, and vice versa.
So when Trump threatens a 100% tariff on Canadian goods, he's not just targeting China indirectly. he's potentially disrupting cost structures and production schedules across both countries. Parts cross that border multiple times before final assembly.
For context, before the 100% tariff was imposed, China exported about 41,678 EVs to Canada in 2023. So the new quota of 49,000 is actually slightly above that pre-tariff flow.
This episode is brought to you by Auto Agentic. We're building the intelligence foundation for the automotive industry, and what we're seeing with this Canada-China deal perfectly illustrates why coordination matters more than individual tools or policies.
2024 and 2025 were foundation years for automotive intelligence. 2026 is when pilots become playbooks. Auto Agentic is working with a limited number of automotive organizations this year to prove agentic coordination in real operations.
Because what Canada is really attempting is what Raz calls walking a fine line. They need to diversify away from increasingly unpredictable U.S. trade policy while not losing sight of their deep, decades-long supply chain relationship with the U.S. auto industry.
Now back to the episode. Let's talk about what consumers will actually experience, because that's where the rubber meets the road, literally. And the consumer dynamics here are more complex than the headlines suggest.
Raz points to infrastructure as the biggest concern. Lower prices only go so far if Canadians can't easily charge their vehicles at work or at home, especially condo dwellers and renters in dense cities.
But there's also what he calls the supply chain paradox. Chinese EVs enter Canada as fully built vehicles and don't support Canada's growing EV and battery supply chain. So more imports without parallel demand for locally made EVs could undercut domestic investment and jobs.
And then there's the data security question. Though Raz makes an important contextual point, digital security risks exist across the entire connected vehicle market and are not unique to Chinese brands. These concerns shouldn't be dismissed, but need perspective.
What's really interesting is the investment angle. Chinese Ambassador Kong Peiwu pitched this as a first step toward new Canadian jobs, cheaper cars, and greener roads, emphasizing that China encourages and supports its companies investing and starting up in Canada.
A senior Canadian government source briefed reporters that Ottawa doesn't see this deal as an economic threat because it plays into a larger strategy of eventually building Chinese EVs in Canada. That's a significant hint about where this could lead.
So the question becomes, is this just an import market, or does Canada become what analysts are calling a hybrid node linking Chinese technology and capital with North American markets?
That scenario hinges entirely on future U.S. rules regarding Chinese-linked production in Canada and Canada's ability to capture value beyond simply importing finished vehicles.
Let's dive deeper into the consumer behavior shifts, because this is where the intelligence systems have to get sophisticated. Canadian buyers are going to split into distinct segments.
You've got one segment chasing lowest cost, feature-rich EVs, where Chinese brands excel, and another segment sticking to legacy brands for perceived reliability, resale value, and North American or European identity.
But here's the pressure dynamic. Chinese EVs typically offer strong range, modern infotainment, and advanced driver assist features at prices that undercut North American rivals. This raises consumer expectations for what a mid-priced EV should offer.
Which means legacy automakers and dealers are going to face pressure to offer heavier discounts, richer lease incentives, and more aggressive financing on both EVs and efficient ICE hybrid models to defend market share.
And remember, Canada's zero-emission vehicle standard requires ZEVs to reach at least 20% of new sales by 2026, 60% by 2030, and 100% by 2035. Cheaper imports help close that gap.
But the more those mandates are met via imports, the more pressure there is on domestic producers to either specialize in higher margin segments or seek efficiency gains to survive head-to-head competition.
Let's zoom out to the global context, because Canada's move is being watched internationally as the first G7 country to partially break with US protectionism on Chinese EVs through this quota plus tariff model.
China now accounts for roughly 70% of global EV production. They're exporting extensively to Europe, Asia, emerging markets, and now testing North American waters through Canada. The EU has launched anti-subsidy investigations and introduced tariffs on some Chinese EV imports.
If this Canadian model, Quota-capped imports at normal MFN rates plus strict monitoring proves politically and economically sustainable. Other mid-sized economies may consider similar frameworks to balance climate goals, affordability, and industrial policy.
The competitive pressure is already accelerating consolidation among Western automakers. They're racing to cut EV costs, standardize platforms, and move away from early high-priced halo EVs toward mass-market competition that can compete on price.
Prime Minister Mark Carney has framed this strategically. He called it a return to levels prior to recent trade frictions, but under an agreement that promises much more for Canadians. He's depicting this as a historic reset and new strategic partnership with China.
Carney argues that for Canada to build its own competitive EV sector, we will need to learn from innovative partners, access their supply chains, and increase local demand. This is industrial policy, not just trade policy.
Chinese President Xi Jinping hailed the agreement as a turnaround in China-Canada relations and said it opened a new chapter in cooperation, so both sides are treating this as strategically significant.
But here's where the tensions really crystallize. This is happening as Washington and Ottawa are renegotiating aspects of their trade framework, including rules of origin, EV battery content, and critical minerals under the broader North American trade agreement.
US negotiators are expected to push for stricter limits on Chinese content in any vehicles or batteries entering the US duty-free from Canada. That could constrain how far Canada can integrate Chinese EVs into a North American production network.
Trump has also argued that Canada must not be allowed to act as a drop-off port for Chinese products headed into the US market. That language suggests he sees this as a strategic threat, not just a trade irritant.
The industry groups argue that Chinese automakers benefit from heavy state subsidies and immense domestic scale, enabling them to undercut North American producers on entry-level EVs where margins are already thin.
They fear a scenario where imported low-cost Chinese EVs erode domestic share in the fastest-growing segment, while Canadian and U.S. plants are still amortizing massive investments in EV platforms and battery plants.
But here are the tensions that really matter for automotive intelligence: affordability versus domestic industry health. Cheaper Chinese EVs clearly support affordability and help meet EV sales mandates, but heavy reliance on imports risks undermining domestic EV and battery investments.
And then there's diversification versus U.S. market dependence. Carney is using this deal to diversify away from an unpredictable U.S. trading environment and repair ties with China. Yet Canada's auto sector is structurally dependent on U.S. market access.
The third tension is climate ambition versus geopolitical alignment. Climate policy and consumer affordability pull Canada toward accepting low-cost Chinese EVs to hit ZEV targets, but security concerns, alliance politics, and U.S. pressure push in the opposite direction.
So let's talk scenarios, because that's how intelligence systems plan for uncertainty. Scenario 1, controlled integration. No full trade war.
Canada sticks to the quota. Chinese brands gain a modest but meaningful foothold, mostly in affordable EV segments. US negotiators don't like it, but settle for stricter content rules and monitoring to prevent Chinese content vehicles entering tariff-free via Canada.
Canadian consumers see more choice and lower EV prices. Domestic industry faces tough competition, but uses the period to sharpen costs and product offerings. Chinese manufacturers potentially invest in Canadian assembly or battery plants.
Scenario 2, escalation and fragmentation. Trump follows through with 100% tariffs on Canadian goods. Auto and parts flows across the border get disrupted instantly. Both Canadian and US consumers pay more for vehicles.
In that scenario, automakers pause or redirect investments, dealerships face price spikes and inventory uncertainty, and Canada gets forced to choose between backing down on Chinese EVs or doubling down on a China-aligned trade strategy.
RAS warns that without flanking policies such as procurement rules, local content incentives, or targeted support for Canadian battery and EV manufacturing, the country risks being just an import market rather than a full participant in the EV value chain.
What strikes me most about this situation is how it illustrates the need for intelligence architecture that can handle multiple variable optimization in real time.
Exactly. You've got consumer affordability, climate targets, industrial policy, geopolitical relationships, supply chain resilience, all these variables shifting simultaneously based on one policy decision.
And the traditional approach of optimizing for one variable at a time, Whether that's lowest cost or domestic jobs or alliance politics, that approach breaks down when you're dealing with this level of complexity.
This is exactly why automotive intelligence architecture matters. You need systems that can coordinate across multiple objectives, anticipate second-order effects, and maintain operational coherence when individual market conditions shift dramatically.
The quota currently represents around 2.5 to 3% of annual Canadian light vehicle sales, suggesting a controlled test of Chinese competition rather than an open-ended flood. But domestic manufacturers fear the precedent and future quota expansions.
And there's the investment timeline question. Officials have hinted that Ottawa views the EV import quota as part of a larger strategy through joint ventures or greenfield plants. But the timing matters crucially for existing investment commitments.
If Chinese automakers and suppliers invest in Canadian assembly or battery plants, and if Canada can maintain at least partial tariff-free access to the U.S., the country could become that hybrid node linking Chinese technology and capital with North American markets.
But that scenario hinges on future US rules regarding Chinese-linked production in Canada and on Canada's ability to capture value beyond simply importing finished vehicles.
So what's the real takeaway here? I think it's that the automotive industry is entering a phase where policy decisions, consumer behavior, and investment flows are becoming more tightly coupled and more volatile.
The Canada-China EV deal isn't just about tariffs or even about EVs. It's about how automotive organizations navigate an environment where traditional stable relationships like the US-Canada auto trade relationship can suddenly become pressure points.
And whether Canada's approach succeeds or fails, it's establishing a new template for how automotive markets might evolve. Controlled access arrangements, multiple supplier relationships, and constant recalibration based on geopolitical shifts.
The question for automotive leaders isn't whether this kind of complexity will become the norm. It already is. The question is whether your organization's intelligence architecture can coordinate effectively in this environment.
Because what we're seeing play out between Canada, China, and the US over EVs is just the beginning. Battery supply chains, critical minerals, data governance, autonomous vehicle standards, every major automotive technology is becoming a geopolitical coordination challenge.
Raz puts it well, Canada must rebuild EV demand at home while ensuring that policies and incentives also drive demand for Canadian-produced EVs, batteries and parts, or much of the economic benefit will flow elsewhere.
That's the intelligence challenge in a nutshell. How do you optimize for multiple objectives simultaneously when the variables keep shifting and the constraints keep changing?
This episode was produced by the team at Auto Agentic. Learn more at autoagentic.ai. Special thanks to Barry Hillier, founder and producer of Auto Intelligence, for making these conversations possible.
If you have topic ideas, industry stories, or companies and people shaping mobility that we should cover, reach out to Barry at autoagentic.ai.
The automotive industry is building the playbooks it will operate on for the next decade. How those playbooks handle complexity, uncertainty, and coordination will determine which organizations thrive and which ones get disrupted by the next Canada-China deal.
Until next Tuesday, keep building intelligence that endures.